Hi there, it's Alexandra from the Middlesized Garden YouTube channel and blog. And I'm here with Stephen Ryan, who is an Australian gardening TV and broadcasting and radio presenter at his nursery, Dixonia Plants, near Melbourne. And we're going to talk about cannas, how to grow them and how to choose them and how to make sure they survive in a fairly temperate northern climate. That's Northern America or Northern Europe or the UK, or indeed in Australia here, it would be a southern one because Melbourne is quite a temperate climate. Isn't that right, Stephen?
It certainly is. When you're choosing a canna, of course, there are several things involved. Colour is, of course, the prime thing, so you're selecting a colour that you like, but you also have to consider the foliage because cannas are really good foliage plants, so you need to know whether you're selecting a burgundy leaf variety, a grey leaf variety or green. And the other thing that some people aren't aware of is that cannas actually have quite a multitude of heights, so you can get quite dwarf ones that rarely grow above the sort of metre tall, right up to some of the very big ones that can get up above 3 metres. So the height is really important, as well as colour and foliage. Some people are frightened to buy taller cannas, and I might add that I think they're the best personally because their verticality is what cannas are all about. I think if they're bred down too small, they lose their point as a garden plant. So I like big tall ones with big foliage and I have to say showy flowers, which might make me a bit coarse, I don't know, but I enjoy cannas because of their exoticness. When you're buying a canna, it's a very good idea to talk to the person selling it to you to make sure that their stock is clean of virus, which is the main issue through most of Europe, North America, and in fact here in Australia as well. There is canna virus here too. It leaves the leaves all mottled, and although the canna will survive it, its foliage is really awful looking and it does have an impact on the vigour of the plant. So make sure the cannas are clean. Also, if you're buying them as bare tubers, which is what most people do, or bare rhizomes, try and make sure that they're going to send you a nice chunky one with a couple of different eyes on it, because if it's just a tiny little end piece with virtually no root system, they can often be quite hard to re-establish. So a good chunky piece. Obviously, though, if you're buying them as pot-grown plants in flower, which is actually quite a good way to buy a canna because you know exactly what you're getting, then look for one that's healthy and that's got multiple stems in the pot, and you really can't go too far wrong then.
Brilliant.
When you plant cannas, the thing to think about with cannas is they're a plant that comes from quite moist conditions in the wild. In fact, some of them are actually water plants. There are actually a group of cannas called the water cannas, which will actually grow in water. So they like lots of water, and because they grow incredibly vigorously through their growing season, they need lots of tucker to keep them going. So I always say to people, if you're planting cannas, put them under a dripping tap and then tie a horse to the tap. So really you can't overwater and you can't overfeed a canna. So good rich soil is really important. An open sunny aspect is important. The more sun you can give a canna, the better it will do. And make sure the soil is well enriched with plenty of old manure, and you can keep topping that up through the season because they'll just keep gobbling it up. Cannas being a subtropical to tropical group of plants, in temperate climates, particularly those where you get really harsh winters, you probably will need to lift your cannas and store them in the shed or the garage, or if you're lucky enough, the cellar, whatever place you've got to keep the cold off them. They don't want to be kept dead dry, so you'd put them into sand or peat or something like that and just keep the rhizomes from completely drying out. And then you can pot them up early if you want to and get them started. So if you've got a nice warm place in the early spring, you can get them underway in a pot, and then you can put them out into the ground later in the year. I always remember being in Christopher Lloyd's garden in England, actually, where he used to grow cannas in polystyrene boxes, and he'd get them well grown and almost in bud, and then when things were over in the long border, he would pull out the things that were finished, and then he would take the cannas out and sink them straight in the garden in bud, ready to flower. So within days, it looked like the border hadn't been touched. So cannas can be really useful late season plants that you can use to fill those gaps when earlier plants are over, when the bulbs have finished and died down. So if you're a really tricky gardener and you want to get the best value out of your border or your area, then cannas can be very useful in that way. So yes, you'll need to store them in the winter. In our climate here in southern Victoria, they're generally quite happy to stay in the ground. But then having said that, every few years they need to be lifted, divided and replanted again, because eventually they'll make quite large clumps and the centre of the clump will start getting a bit tatty and sad looking. So you need to refresh them on a regular basis, and you would do that if you're not lifting them out of the ground to store them. You'd do that sometime during the winter and then just replant straight away.
Yeah, super.
If you're in a comparatively cool climate and you're going to keep your cannas in the ground, then yes, you could easily put a mulch or some bracken fern or some straw or something like that over the crowns, which will stop the frost from really getting down into the ground and freezing the cannas. So it might be easier in some climates when you're a bit borderline just to put some sort of cover over them, and then you can leave them in the ground, which saves quite a bit of work, I have to say. Now, something else you should know about cannas is, in fact, that canna lilies will thrive on neglect in some ways, but they can often look quite scruffy. So if you want your cannas to look at their best, then you need to preen and clean them regularly. So what I suggest is that when a flower spike finishes at the top of the stem, you check down the stem, and if there's a swelling down there partway down behind a bract, you will have another flower spike coming. So as soon as that flower spike finishes, you cut it off. The next one will come up, and then you haven't got the dead tatty flowers getting in the way of the really nice ones, and it's also not trying to produce seed, which can have an impact on the vigor of the plant. Some canna hybrids will have a third flower spike that you can work to. Once the flowers are finished in that stem, then in general, I would take that stem right down to ground level, because that encourages more to come up from the bottom with fresh leaves. They look vigorous and healthy. So it's a matter of regularly cleaning them, even to the extent of deadheading them if they're not one of those that clean themselves. There are some cannas that drop their flowers before they go brown and don't hold them, and they're always worthwhile looking out for. But if they've got dead flowers through the head, pluck them out, and it's amazing what a difference it can make, and it takes minutes.
You can find a link to Stephen Ryan's Dicksonia Rare Plants Nursery near Melbourne in the description below, along with also details of his European and international garden tours. If you've enjoyed this, please do hit like, and I'll know you might like to see more about individual plants, and do let me know if there are any particular plants you'd like a focus on. If you haven't subscribed to the Middlesized Garden YouTube channel, we upload on Saturdays with tips, ideas and inspiration, garden visits and interviews with experts for people whose gardens feel just a little bit big when they're doing something like weeding, but who always find them a bit too small when you want to get in that extra gorgeous plant. So do join us, and thank you for watching.